Cool. So as Ben mentioned, I'm going to be talking about Hinduism. We're going to start with some history and background to get a better idea of some groundwork there, and then go into major beliefs, contrast with Christianity, and look at some applications of how that plays out in the world today. So starting with history and background, there's about 1 billion people today that claim to be Hindu or practice some form of Hinduism. It's known as one of the world's oldest religions. To the Hindu, it's eternal. It's been around for forever because it is this adaptable, eternal way of life. You can see on the map here, this shows the countries with the highest percentage of Hindus. So India is going to have that highest percentage, but there are Hindus in South America as well as a few places in Africa as well, different islands, and obviously there's Hindus living in the United States today, living in other parts of the world, but this map shows where the highest population is. And then we're going to cover some vocabulary. Right off the bat, I don't speak Hindi. I've gotten checks on some pronunciations, but I might butcher some things, so please give me some grace there. But here's some key terms. We're going to revisit these when we come back to major beliefs. The first is Atman. This is the belief in soul, so that the body is not just physical, but there is a soul. And then Dharma, this is the path of life. It's individual to each person. We'll talk a lot more about that later. And then Karma is the effect of actions. Samsara is the cycle of life, including rebirth. And then Moksha, that is the release from that cycle of samsara. Looking at some history, Hinduism originates from the Indus Valley with the Indo-Aryan people. The Aryans were not a race, they were a class. And so they moved to the Indus Valley, and then some of those beliefs mixed with native peoples of the region. And then in the Vedic period, which is the 1,000 years between 1500 BC and 500 BC, that's the time that the Vedas were believed to have been composed. The Vedas are like the sacred texts of Hinduism. And then during the classical period, this was a time when emphasis on worship of deities was taking place. There were temples that were constructed. Okay, so the Vedas are the sacred text of Hinduism. There are numerous books within each book, there's different chapters, different books in the book, if that makes sense. And then also some commentary at the end of each book to summarize, answer some questions. But the Vedas are believed to be eternal, so they weren't necessarily given from God like we might think of with other religions, but rather they're these eternal truths that were revealed to people through these deep meditative states. So the Vedas cover this divine epic battle, and through those stories you can glean different morals, you can see different instructions specifically on ways of living, and there's some stories similar to parables, but they tell this great story of the gods and of how life came to be as we know it today, this epic battle, all these things. So there's a few different specific Vedas. The Rig Veda is the proper religious observance and practice and covers the fundamental questions of existence. So this is the first book. It's like the groundwork of here's what we know about our existence and what does that mean for us as we observe religion, as we practice it. And then you have the Sama Veda, which has different songs, chants, and texts that are specifically meant for singing. The Yajur Veda has different recitations, as well as the rituals that are involved with worship, and then the chants involved in worship services. And then the Atharva Veda is pretty different from the first three. So the first three are saying, here's our general look at our existence, and what does that mean for us, and what does that mean for how we worship. And then the Atharva Veda is different in that it has specific spells of, warding off spirits, specific ceremonies, as in, funerals and weddings, and how should those be performed. And then observations of daily life. Within these Vedas, there is the Mahabharata, which is the longest epic poem, and it's the closest thing that you'll find in the Vedas to a moral code. So those are some important things to know about the Vedas. And now we'll get into some of the major beliefs of Hinduism. This was a quote that I found super helpful. It says, "All Hindus worship one supreme reality, though they call it by many names. There is no eternal hell, no damnation in Hinduism, and no intrinsic evil, no satanic force that opposes the will of God. Hindus believe that the cosmos was created out of God and is permeated by him or her, a supreme being who both is form and pervades form, who creates, sustains, and destroys the universe only to recreate it again in unending cycles. Each soul is free to find their own way, whether by devotion, austerity, meditation, yoga, or selfless service." So we'll unpack that as we move on. In terms of worldview, Hinduism is actually henotheistic, so that means that there is a single deity, and at the same time there are other gods and goddesses that are recognized. It's a little confusing, but in to kind of break it down, so Hindus believe that there's this infinite divine being, it's called Brahman, which is manifested in countless ways. So there's two main takes on what this really looks like. One would say that there's kind of three main gods in Hinduism. That's going to be Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Brahma is the god who creates. Vishnu is the god who sustains and preserves, and then Shiva is the god who destroys. So together they create this cycle of rebirth, right, of what life looks like. When it's created, it's sustained, it grows, and then at some point it's destroyed so that new life can be born again. There is a special relationship along with each name. So the second main view of Hinduism would say that all the deities are manifestations of one deity, of Brahman. And that with each new name of God, there's this special relationship. So it's described as the same way that one single person might be called father by his son, or coworker by his friend, or employee by or boss by his employee, that type of thing, husband by his wife. So there's a special relationship associated with each name. And there are also avatars, and those are incarnations of a god. So they may also be worshipped. And within Hinduism, there are thousands of gods. There are so many. We could not cover them all tonight. So that is the aspect of there's this one divine being, but there's countless manifestations of it. Hindus believe in the universal soul. So the Atman that we talked about earlier, the soul that is in life, that's also in living creatures. It's in other living organisms like plants. There is this universal soul. And they have a circular view of life and time. So in our Western worldview, we often see it as linear, right? We're born and we live and we die, and there's something after that. Maybe there was something before we were born, that type of thinking. But Hindus would see it as circular. So you're born in one life and you die in that life, but you're reborn into another life. And it's this cycle, like we talked about with the three main gods, of life and then destruction to give way to new life. And then Maya is a term that refers to the disconnect between divine reality and our perception of the world. So while reality is believed to be divine, that there's this universal soul in all of life, we might not always see it that way. And so that disconnect is called Maya. And so for the Hindu, purpose is to reach the gap of this, right? This disconnect between how we perceive the world, how it actually is, and so how can we bridge that gap? So the idea is that you have a soul within you that is seeking your destiny, that is seeking this universal soul, and your body, your mind, your physical self isn't really on board with that. They're disconnected from that soul that's seeking those things. And so the purpose of life is to connect that soul and the mind to find your path. And so then we come back to Dharma, which is an individual's right path or way of living. So this is revealed when the soul and the mind are connected, and it's going to look really different for each person, which is also why Hinduism is going to span really broadly and look really different for different people. So thoughts and actions are believed to imprint on the soul. So when you think of the idea of karma, we usually think of it as you put good out there, good comes back to you. That's kind of an oversimplification of it. It's more about the idea of everything you do, everything you think, everything in your life is imprinting on your soul, and that is then affecting your next life, if that kind of makes sense. So yoga is a term that describes that union of the soul and the mind, and there's different ways that this can look. So the first one is karma yoga, which is right actions and thoughts. So focusing on right, not in the sense of morally right or wrong. It's right in the sense that it aligns with your dharma, your path. And then bhakti yoga is the feeling of God's presence. So this might be practiced through going to the temple, through worshiping, through offering sacrifices, those types of things. And then jnana yoga is seeing divine reality in all things. So I talked about earlier, where there's this separation between the divine reality and how we perceive things. Jnana yoga is going to seek to bridge that gap and see that divine reality in all things. And then there's Raja Yoga, which is mental control and meditation. So it's a little bit different from the Karma Yoga. Karma Yoga is focused on having the right actions, the right thoughts, whereas Raja Yoga is focused on, like, let me calm down, let me connect my mind and my soul, and have control over the mind. And so this is often sought through meditation. And then we come to ideas like salvation. This looks really different in Hinduism than what we might be used to in Christianity. So there's not an objective like good and evil in Hinduism. It's more of the idea of good being you're at peace, you're on your right path, and evil is like you are uncontrolled in your path, you have like anger in you that's not controlled. So it's more about whether you are on the right path for yourself. And then moksha is that term that describes kind of what we would think of as salvation, and that's that release from the cycle of rebirth. So it's believed that every soul is going to attain moksha, it just might take more lives to do it. Like it's not going to be the exact same number of lives to reach it. And so it's this idea of finding your path, following your dharma, so that in your next life you are proceeding along that path. You're not going to like see that progression, but that's the idea behind it. And then once you have fulfilled your dharma, your path, you attain moksha, which is that release from the cycle of rebirth. And then that is described as union between the individual and God. So it's you have that universal soul within you, and now your universal soul is joining the rest of the universal soul. That kind of makes sense. And so it's all about the experience of eternal truth within oneself. So if your dharma is individual to you, you need to find it within yourself. And it's very non-exclusive, so Hindus are very tolerant of other religions, seeing like, okay, that's your dharma, that's your way of following your path in life. So they're very accepting in that aspect. This is a quote that better describes that gap between what we perceive and what is reality to the Hindu. And so it says, the illustration given is that of a rope, mistaken in the semi-darkness for a snake. The snake of this world frightens us. What is the solution? Bring a light and you will see its real nature. It is only a rope. Likewise, the real nature or essence of this world is divinity alone. Bring the light of spiritual wisdom through yoga and you will see God alone everywhere. This is what constitutes spiritual freedom or liberation, moksha. When this knowledge dawns, there's a complete satisfaction. No desire remains in the mind, and no further impulse for rebirth remains. So that kind of describes that dharma, that path, that bridging the gap, and then attaining moksha. So there's a lot of social influence that accompanies this belief system. As I mentioned previously, there's a really wide acceptance of other religions and faiths. The caste system had a huge influence in India. What this is it's that your dharma influences, or your caste rather, influences your dharma. And so your path in life is affected by your social status in life. And that status, that caste, where you are in your dharma, then determines like how you're viewed by society, who you can marry, a lot of other stuff as well. So when India became independent, discrimination based on caste was banned, but it is still really common today for people to only marry within their same caste. And you can see the different castes here. So at the top you have the Brahmin, and these are like the priests, the academics, so priests and teachers, and then Kshatriyas, which are like rulers and soldiers. You'll see warriors and kings on that graphic. And then you have the Vaishyas, which are the merchants, so like kind of your more common workers in a sense, but then the Sudra are the real like commoners, peasants, servants, that type of class. And then beneath that you have the untouchables, so they're not even considered like a caste, they're below the caste system. And those are the people that are like the lowest in society, so that type of idea. And then in terms of like daily life and influence, it's very common for Hindu people to be vegetarian. If you believe that the universal soul is in all living things, it makes sense that you wouldn't be eating other living things as in animals. And then they also may avoid certain foods because of the body and soul. So it's not like a certain food is unholy or unclean, but one example I got from one of my interviews was like garlic. It's kind of known to like increase anger in the body, that type of thing. So Hindus might avoid certain foods for those reasons, more of how it affects their body, their soul, their emotions, than necessarily whether it's like right or wrong. So when we contrast Hinduism with Christianity, there's a whole string of differences. We're going to kind of break them down one by one. So in Christianity, it is believed, like Hinduism, that there is one God. In Hinduism, it's a little more loose. It's one divine being. In Christianity, it's one God, the God of the Bible. And we have this idea of the Trinity, which is three persons that are distinct, and yet they are one. We have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. In Hinduism, this divine being, as I mentioned earlier, is manifested in countless forms. Some would hold to those three main gods that I mentioned earlier, but they're not the Trinity in the sense that we view the Trinity in Christianity. And then with good and evil, Christians believe that good is based on God's character, that there is this objective standard of what is morally good. And then anything that opposes God's character is morally evil. And sin is that choice to choose our way over God's way. In Hinduism, good and evil is more subjective. It's going to be the right action for one person is not necessarily the right action for another person. And then salvation in Christianity is the forgiveness of sins through Jesus alone. Jesus makes a really exclusive claim of, I'm the way to the Father, the only way. In Hinduism, the salvation is that moksha, that release from the cycle of rebirth, and it's brought on when a person fulfills their path and they're united with the divine being. The idea of eternity in Christianity is, again, looking at that linear thinking of it comes after death, and it's either spent apart from God or with God. But in Hinduism, it's that circular thinking of eternity has always been going on, but once you see the divine reality, you're united with the divine being. And so you'll reincarnate until your dharma is completed. And then, as I mentioned, the more linear view of time versus the more circular view of time, Christians do believe eternity is eternity, right? It's been since before we were here, it'll be forever after we're gone. But it's not that circular thinking in terms of our lives on earth. And the purpose of life to the Christian is to have this relationship with God. Some say as to know God and to make him known, right? In Hinduism, your purpose is to find and fulfill your dharma. And so that's going to look really different for a lot of different people. And then life in general, this was kind of the key factor that I found of distinguishing between Christians and Hindus. To the Christian, there is this component of dependence on God, that my life is transformed because of what God does. Whereas in Hinduism, the point is to connect the mind and the soul, and also to appease the gods. That's going to kind of vary between people. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So how does this apply day in and day out? We're going to look at some of the main gods of Hinduism. So each god has an image that's associated with them. It's very, very common, almost expected for anyone who is Hindu to have some type of shrine or altar in their house. And they will offer offerings to these gods. That will be the place where they pray. They can pray at other places as well. And there's all sorts of rituals as well. And some follow a few of those rituals in terms of how to cleanse before you pray. Others are going to follow more of those rituals. It again depends on your dharma, right? If you are following more of the karma yoga path of right actions and right thoughts, you're not going to be as focused on the rituals that you're doing, or necessarily what you're offering. So these are those three main gods that I touched on at the beginning. Brahma is that god who creates, and then Vishnu is the preserver and sustainer, and Shiva is the god of destruction. And then here are some more, we'll cover 6 more really common gods. Ganesh or Ganesha is the god of success, knowledge, and wealth. Krishna is the god of love and compassion. And then Saraswati is the goddess of knowledge, art, and music. And then Rama is the god of truth and virtue. Rama is believed to be an avatar of Vishnu and is also the embodiment of humankind. And then Durga is the protector of the righteous and destroyer of evil. So you often see her pictured riding on a tiger or a lion. And then Kali is the goddess of death and is meant to be this kind of inciting force of doom is heading towards us kind of idea. And here's some Hindu influence that you will see today in your day-to-day. One that's really common is yoga, right? So yoga is not necessarily worship of Hindu gods, but there are a lot of components of symbolism that correlate with worship of Hindu gods. So just because you do yoga does not mean that you're worshiping Hindu gods, but you should know that yoga is commonly used as a form of worship to Hindu gods. So there's a ton of symbolism in this. One is like when you make the, what is it called? Sorry, give me just a second. The Gwayan Mudra is this like common hand symbol, and this is meant to symbolize that the soul, which is the Atman, is like represented by the forefinger, and then the life force, the Brahman, is represented by the thumb, and so it's like you're connecting the two. So that's the idea of yoga, being connecting that soul with the body. And the purpose of yoga is to align the chakras in the body, which are like the energy discs. Is kind of how it's thought of. So it's like a physical way of aligning that energy, connecting the soul with the body again. So there's different poses that you can see here. The first is the tree pose on the left there, and that is meant to give honor to Vishnu, the creator, sustainer god. And then you have the dancer pose, which is a form of worship to Shiva, the destroyer. And then at the bottom here, this is the goddess pose, and this is meant to give worship to Kali, which was, if we circle back, this one right here. You'll also see meditation as a really common way. I remember when I was a kid, like fake meditating in a way of saying like Om. Fun fact, Om is actually the sound that was believed to like create everything. It's like in the Vedas, Om is the sound of creation of life. I had no idea. And so meditation is something where influence of Hinduism today. And then here's two different festivals. Diwali is the festival of lights. It's this celebration of good triumphing evil. And it celebrates various gods depending on who you talk to. Within Hinduism, there's different sects that worship different gods more than others. But those are some common gods that are celebrated during Diwali. And then Holi is the festival of colors. It celebrates love between Radha and Krishna. So depending on like where you look, there's belief that like gods could have this like counterpart of the opposite sex in a way, or they could be like married to other gods, that type of idea. And so Holi celebrates this love between Radha and Krishna, and again is a celebration of triumph of good over evil. There's a lot of other holidays that will be celebrated by Hindus depending on which gods they worship. But those are two main ones that we see, like color runs are a celebration of Holi. So that's something that's been incorporated to like fundraisers, all sorts of different things. But this stems from Holi. So when you're talking with someone who is Hindu, first of all, be a listener. Like any religion, there's going to be a spectrum of beliefs. This was something I learned last summer. I was in an area that has folk Hinduism present, so it's mainly Hindu, but ancestors are actually worshipped like above other gods. The same thing, there's like folk Islam, there's a whole bunch of where animism kind of mixes with our religion. And so just because you meet someone who says they're Hindu, that doesn't mean that you know what they believe. And so be a listener. And generally, Hindu people are very open to spiritual conversations. It would be helpful in a conversation to focus less on like guilt and forgiveness. I know in our like American minds that's very difficult to do because we hear the gospel is like we're guilty of our sins and we need someone to pay the price, and that's totally true. But for the Hindu person, there isn't this like strict right and wrong morally, right? It's like finding your proper path. So you can still share the gospel, but maybe in a way that shapes it more as that relationship with God. That's still fully the gospel, right? Jesus came to pay for our sins, but he also came to restore us to a relationship with God. And he came to defeat powers of darkness over us. All of those things are present. And so as you're having a conversation with someone, it's going to be really hard to like start with, let's establish morality, right? But if you start with this idea of our relationship with God through Jesus, that's a better starting point. And then gods represent power to most Hindus, and so it's really confusing, like, why would Jesus die? If Jesus is your God, why would he die? That's a sign of weakness. And so that was something I learned from one of my roommates who actually grew up in India, and having that conversation of Jesus being God, but what his death meant, and then focusing on the resurrection as well, of like this was proving that he was God, this was showing his power. And then we have to circle back to the really exclusive claim of Jesus. He said, "I'm the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." If that's true, it changes a lot. And so in your conversations with people who are Hindu, learn from them, be listeners, and these are some things that can hopefully be points of kind of bringing these things up, not forcing these things on anyone, but some different talking points of if Jesus makes this claim as being the only path to God, it has massive repercussions. And again, the key distinction that I found was dependence. Even in walking away from the interview that I did, I was realizing how often do I hang my salvation on Jesus and then say, let me go figure out what God has for my life by figuring it out myself instead of asking God, right? The point of Christianity is not just that we have this right standing with God, but that we have this relationship with God. And so the dependence and the power of God in our lives makes a huge difference. And so I was really convicted in how am I living with dependence on God? How am I asking Him to guide me? How am I asking Him to be present and involved in my life? Because for the Hindu person, it's very individualistic. It's very much finding your own path and also pleasing the gods at the same time. But there's not a certain set right way of doing it, if that makes sense. So that was the key distinction I found, was the dependence on God to save us, to change our lives, versus the independence and individualistic side of Hinduism in terms of finding your path and doing right actions to progress along your path. So we can go to questions now. Yeah.
So are all of the gods eternal, or how does that work?
Yeah, so it's circling back to that idea of there's really one divine being, but there's different manifestations of it. And so they would be considered to be eternal, but they're not necessarily distinct persons. They're part of the divine being, if that kind of makes sense.
So their base is eternal, but they themselves are not eternal.
Yeah, that's kind of a good way of putting it, of the divine being is eternal. They themselves are a manifestation, so it can kind of come and go in a sense. And there are some avatars that were believed to actually be on Earth for a little while that are in the Vedas, but aren't anymore. So yeah, but their base, like you said, the divine being is going to be eternal, but the manifestation might show up for a while, go for a while, but is still at the same time part of the divine being. So it's still something that can be worshipped. If that makes sense. Yeah.
For the reincarnation, so when you are reincarnated, you're born as a new human?
Not necessarily. So going back to the idea of the divine soul being in all life, you could be plant life, animal life, human life. You might, in the caste system, you might be a really lowly person in society and then move up, depending on if you've progressed along your dharma. But you're not going to remember your previous lives or really know where you are on your dharma. So it's something where you won't necessarily see the progression in your individual life, but you have this goal of progressing your soul overall. So.
And then when you do complete, your dharma, you will achieve the
moksha.
The moksha.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that's the release from the cycle of rebirth. And so reincarnation is also thought to explain why some people suffer and why some people have really easy lives. It's because they're at a different place in their dharma and their path. So that's kind of explains suffering. Yeah.
So since everything has that universal soul, plants, animals, why do Hindus choose to be vegetarian or vegan if plants also have that universal soul?
Mm-hmm. Well, they have to eat something, so that is if you have to choose. I don't know. I didn't ask that specific question in my interview, but I would imagine that it's this thought of the life being animal life looks more like human life than plant life does in a sense. So kind of avoiding consuming that life.
Things have blood in it.
Yeah, and blood.
In Christian life, one of the goals is
right relationship with God. I think union is a word that you could use.
Yeah.
How is the Christian goal of unity with God different from the Hindu vision of that?
Yeah, so the Hindu person believes that their soul is part of the divine being, and so that union with God, to the Christian, eternity is spent in the presence of God, right? And so there is this union in a sense, and we believe we have the Holy Spirit within us that is from God, that's changing our lives, but our soul is still distinct from God. And so eternity is spent in God's presence, but not necessarily like as part of God. Whereas for the Hindu person, if their soul is part of this divine being, that union is like a return to being fully part of that divine being, if that kind of makes sense, or more of like a realization that you are part of the divine being. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, Nathaniel?
Does Hinduism consider Jesus an avatar?
I think they would put him more as like a god, but avatars and gods are both worshipped, and so from what I've heard, if a Hindu person accepts Jesus, they would kind of add him on as one of their gods, and so he's also part of the divine being, but he is not God alone, like Christians would view him. So, there is Jenna.
Do Hindus believe like that Earth is eternal, or like that it will end, kind of like in Christianity?
So I believe they would lean more towards the side of eternal, in terms of like when we go back to that quote about everything is the divine reality of everything is part of the divine being, all life is part of the divine being. So in that sense, I think Earth would be seen as eternal, but in the same time it's going through those cycles of life, and then life sustained, and then death, like, and destruction, so that new life can be born. So that's how I would best answer that. I don't totally know for sure, but yeah. Daniel?
In your image of Rama, one of...
Rama?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
What's that on his hand, or her hand, their hand?
It looks like an eye. I did not research Rama specifically to see symbolism behind that. But if you've got like truth and virtue as part of what that god represents, I think that would make sense.
Okay.
If anybody has any more insight on that, you're welcome to chime in.
I honestly couldn't see what it was from back here.
Yeah, that's fair. Very fair. Yeah, Jonathan?
Spider-Man.
Going off of that, in that picture of Kali, that person beneath Kali, is that another god, or is that just supposed to be a human?
I think it's supposed to be a god. I read something about that, but my brain is not recalling it right now, so I apologize. I do not have an answer for you on that one. I can find out later and get back to you, though, because I have an article that I can also send you if you're interested.
Thank you.
Erin?
I know in India, at least, like the cow is considered a sacred animal. How does that fit into that?
Yeah, so that's going back to, I think, to the Vedas, but I'm not sure specifically like why the cow is sacred or why it's considered sacred. So does anybody else have insight on that one?
I'm not sure where it comes from.
That's all right.
There are other temples, like there's a temple in India that's the god is a rat. And so they will go in and pour milk in the middle of this temple, and all the rats come out to drink from that milk. Nobody else is able to touch it, so there's a lot of starving people around the temple, but the rats are fat and healthy. And so they'll just pick different things to...
I think it's somehow some sort of god as well.
Okay.
Like I know that, and sometimes snakes too are also gods.
Okay.
I don't really know.
Yeah. Yeah, Rebecca.
I know you mentioned earlier how like the Hindu idea of good and evil is not necessarily like an objective, but more of like everyone has their own path.
Mm-hmm.
What is it like for like Durga? It says like protector of the righteous, destroyer of evil. I think on the previous slide it said one of the gods, something with good and evil as well.
Yeah.
What sense does that mean? Like, or we were phrased, but yeah.
Yeah, I understand. It's kind of confusing because while there's not necessarily like a morally right and a morally wrong, there is the idea of like light over darkness, right? Like knowledge over ignorance, that type of thing. And so I think that's the idea with this protector of the righteous and destroyer of evil. You can still have people that are like choosing to do things against their like path of life, whether they don't realize what their path of life is or what the right actions are to progress them along that, but there's not necessarily like a moral standard, if that makes more sense, I guess. So there's still this kind of idea of good and evil, And the Vedas are this like epic battle, right? They're the story of the gods like warring over these different things. But there's not necessarily like, here's the standard, that means this is wrong, that means this is right, if that kind of answers your question. Yeah.
So cows are considered holy as one of their gods represents. It's like the god of cows.
Okay.
I don't exactly know which god it is, but it's very popular for Hindus. Another thing is like cows. That's most of the livestock that is in India, and so you're going to have more precedence to keep and protect your cows as they're seen as like commodities that are very like expensive. And then finally, like their milk in the Vedas is shown to be like an ambrosial type of substance that is from the gods.
Okay.
And so people are like, they respect cows, and it's believed that also when people are reincarnated, if they're reincarnated as an animal, it's going to be a cow.
Okay. Yeah.
And so it's like, if you see someone that's gonna die, or know someone that died, and you see a cow, that's them.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. Thank you for that. Other questions? I'll share another interesting fact that I did not include, but was hoping someone would ask me a question on. So, because I thought it was interesting when I found this map of like, why is there a relatively high Hindu population in this part of South America? It's because there were indentured servants, and this area was settled or was owned by the Dutch for a while, and then they worked out this agreement with Britain, and so they had these indentured servants from India who were working in Guyana and these different countries. So, fun little tidbit was that was how Hinduism spread to South America.
Is that kind of how it ended up in the United Arab Emirates with all of the construction projects?
I believe so, yeah. Yeah. So, similar thing of a lot of indentured servanthood leading to that.
And also with Fiji.
I think so. I didn't see anything specifically about Fiji. It would be a good guess, but I couldn't tell you for certain. So, yeah. Any other questions?
Where do we see this play out in modern America, media or movies? Can you expound on any of that? Do you know?
So I was talking with Ben about this a little bit, and one that came to mind was Aladdin, but then I was thinking more about it, and Aladdin is not a Hindu representation. But there's, I lost the thing that was in my head. Would you have any
We got the
insight to share
movie
with us?
Avatar.
Oh, yes. Yeah, and also the avatars of Hinduism are often blue-skinned, and so that's an interesting tie-in there. That's a good point.
Also the movie series Divergent. If you go to your caste system image, has all the same cast.
Go back to the cast. There you go. Yeah, Chris.
Most Pixar movies I was allowed to watch growing up because almost all of them have this idea of karma, especially that where there's evil, there has to be bad as well. There's a mix of that. So, especially children movies, there's often, and growing up with that, sometimes I'll watch a children movie that I say before, like you can see it. It's not a Christian idea.
Definitely. Yeah, there's that idea of like, let's do good, but for the sake of good returning to us, that kind of thing. Yeah, another thing I found was I interviewed one person and asked, like, are the gods that you worship the same gods of your parents? They're not always. Like, it can be, a person can kind of choose which gods they relate to more, or like kind of want to worship more, and then the gods also represent different things. So it's going to look pretty different in the States than it might in India, but if a person is seeking, like, if we go forward to, I'm so sorry. These images of the gods. So if someone is seeking love, or if they have a specific affinity in art, they might offer more to Saraswati, versus if they're seeking love, they might go to Krishna. Krishna is like a very, very popular Hindu god, and so is Ganesh as well. Yeah.
There are some you can ask if they have a family god that are passed down from generation to generation, and sometimes they'll switch. Like they did. I talked to one guy, and he said, "Yeah, we used to worship Krishna, but then we did some research and found that actually our family god is Ganesh." And so they switched. Ganesh is popular because it's the god of new beginnings and good luck. And so it's kind of like their star of the day type of deal.
Any other questions?
Not a question, just like, and when you go into a Hindu's house, you're going to see mainly the god of Ganesh
Got like new beginning.
you usually see Ganesh.
Claire? What? I got a question. That's my bad. Anybody else?